Good morning. It's Monday, the 13th of May, and this is Govindraj Ethiraj broadcasting and streaming from and headquartered in Mumbai, India's financial capital. Our top stories and themes for today. Indian markets are still paused, but will they respond to global triggers this week? India is staring at a big power deficit this summer. Will it affect power generation in cities like Mumbai and Delhi? More countries joined the semiconductor subsidy race. Korea is now joining the party. Tech giants are investing billions of dollars in Southeast Asia that India should also be fighting to pull in. And India's worrying dependence on China's dominance in pharmaceutical raw materials.
This is a core report with Govindraj Ethiraj.
The stock markets are on pause even as volatility and fear is high. The stock markets are in a pause mode. I mean, of course, they're moving, but to bulls, even a flat market is a bear market. Now, the bets and speculation are around how the markets would behave on 4th of June when the results of India's 2024 general elections are announced. Of course, that's still a way to go and at least 3 effective weeks and as many trading days within that, but the tension is mounting almost like a cricket match. Now, there are not too many other signals to go by, but when I say there aren't, I mean, of course, there are, from US macro numbers to India macro numbers, but nothing that seems to me that can provide effective triggers, maybe to some extent international. So it will be supply and mostly from domestic investors and funds who are, of course, on a roll like never before. On Friday, the markets ended higher with the Sensex closing at 72,664, up 260 points, while the Nifty closed at 22,055, that's up 97 points. But the markets logged their worst week in 8 weeks or since mid-March. So the volatility index, which we refer to, or India VIX, has now touched 18.47, which is a 19-month high. Volatility indices reflect the fear or apprehension as manifested in futures positions investors are taking. Speaking of investors, foreign investors have already sold about 17,000 crores from Indian equities in the first 10 days of May. Now, this is after heavy buying in April and to some extent March as well. So one reason clearly is that they are taking away some profits, which, by the way, several Indian fund managers, institutional and private wealth managers are saying the same, but not everyone seems to be fully buying into that right now. FIIs are driven, among other factors, by what's happening elsewhere in the world, and that's not looking too encouraging for capital flows too. Remember that US interest rates are high, and the interest rate cuts should have happened by now, but they have not. And that obviously is keeping capital grounded in the United States. Nor is it clear when those interest rate cuts will start, except that there have been promises now for several months that it will be soon. Having said all of that, global markets across Europe and America were strong last week, including London and Frankfurt, which hit record highs. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rose again on Friday, which was now wrapping a 8th consecutive winning session and registering its best week of 2024, according to CNBC. The 30 stock index added about 125 points to close at 39,512. The S&P was higher too, though the Nasdaq was down marginally. Overall, for the Dow Jones, once again, it was the best week since December and its 4th positive week in a row. Elsewhere on the commodities side, copper is high and oil was quoting at just under $83 a barrel, down again after crossing $84 a barrel last week. Tensions are high in the Middle East and the forces keeping oil prices low are also strong. So the default position for oil in recent months appears to be lower, as we've discussed here on the core report. Copper prices are, of course, high. There's a lot of action, particularly with copper companies, and we'll come to that in coming days. Power demand in India is set to hit new records. So demand for power in India is rising. The fact that there are heat waves already slamming the country is not helping. India is projecting its biggest power shortfall in 14 years in June after a fall in hydropower generation, according to Reuters, and is also racing to avoid outages by deferring planned plant maintenance and reopening idled units. This deficit also follows delays, Reuters said, in the commissioning of 3.6 gigawatts of new coal-fired plants, which had been targeted to be operational before March. Thanks to all of this, a peak shortage of 14 gigawatts is forecast in June during nighttime hours when solar capacity is offline. According to the Central Electricity Authority, which is India's planning body for the power sector and reported by Reuters. Now, this gap is the widest since 2009-10, according to publicly available data. Now, India's hydroelectricity output has fallen at the steepest pace in 4 decades of 40 years in the year ended March 31st, when renewable energy generation was flat. Hydroelectricity output is obviously linked to water levels and rains, and we'll come to all of that, including India's total energy ask, in a moment. Elsewhere, coal imports rose by about 8% to 268 million tons in 23-24. That's the last financial year, thanks to softer seaborne prices and the likelihood of increase in power demand during summer, according to Business Standard. Coal imports were 249 million tons the year before that, said the Business Standard, also adding that imports were rising every month and stood at around 24 million tons in March. Domestic production of coal is also rising, and all India production of coal during 23-24 was also at about 1,000 million tons, which in turn grew about 12% over the previous year. So, where does all of this leave us in terms of power demand? How ready are we for peaks, including those induced by heat waves? Will the systems hold out to extreme and record demands? So, I reached out to Karthik Ganesan, Director Research Coordination at the Council for Energy, Environment and Water, or CEEW. And I began by asking Karthik, who holds a bachelor's and master's in civil engineering from IIT Madras and a degree in public policy from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, how he was projecting peak demand across India and in major cities like Mumbai and Delhi, where many of us stay.
As we're seeing, there are, of course, increasing incidences of days when the temperature is much higher, and that's a big driver of demand. What we're seeing right now is that in the last 10 days, so to say, in May, we find that the demand is about 10% higher. The peak demand is 10% higher than what we had last year. This year, the preparation, has allowed us to touch about 227, which is, and it was expected to touch about 235 in June. The CA had earlier predicted that this year, June would be about 240. So now they have scaled it back to 235. So it's really going to be informed by the way the weather plays out and the Met plays out. And there could be reprieve that comes in. But basically, we find that, that the Met is more favorable. And what we're seeing here is that IMD has basically said that there are going to be 2 weeks and see persistent sort of high temperatures in many parts of the country. And outside of that, we might be returning to some semblance of longer term normalcy, but that remains to be seen. But we're looking at about a 10% higher demand anywhere in the mid 230s for this summer.
So that's 230 gigawatts. And what's the capacity at a national level once again?
Yeah, so we've got about 215 gigawatt worth of thermal, right? And this peak is basically an evening peak. Right now, it's still very much a daytime peak. Right? And your evening peak, it's only the thermal that's going to largely contribute to it. The maximum contribution that comes from RE is between, 15 and 20 gigawatts. That's it, right? So the bulk of it will have to come.
So when you say RE, you mean renewables like solar and so on?
Renewable energy, solar and wind only, not hydro, right? I'm talking only solar and wind. Hydro is separate. Hydro has always played an outsized role because of the flexibility it offers. What we're seeing is that this year, thermal is already sort of, operating at unprecedented levels, right? 190 gigawatt worth of our thermal capacity is online, which has never been the case. And the number of plants that are under outage is less than 20 gigawatt, which typically is, as north of 30 gigawatt because, plants are either in maintenance or they're not functioning. But this year, it looks like all hands on deck and everybody's expected to be there, at least to see through the summer intense heat. And then they will probably go into some sort of maintenance and other regular shutdown modes, right, through July. So overall capacity availability for now seems good. And the other important part is gas. This year, it's small, but what was earlier at, 3 to 4 gigawatt has gone up to about 8 to 10 gigawatt worth of contribution in the evenings and nights, right? So the government has also invoked, Section 11 to have all plants available, to generate. And they've said the tariff will be passed through. So about 8 to 10 gigawatts worth of gas has also been sort of contributing to the overall peak this year. So, it looks like, everything's being prepped to manage this demand, at least, for this year, especially given that it's an election year.
Right. Now, specifically cities like Mumbai and Delhi, are they all equally geared in terms of supply to meet the demand that we are anticipating this summer? Peak summer, rather.
Yeah, the peak summer. So, the peak demand the actual peak comes in much later, right? The July, August peak, when the monsoon really comes in and increases humidity is when Delhi's peak becomes higher because, a lot more air conditioner users see. It's not yet gotten to the point where, it is touching some of these historic peaks. It is expected to breach the 8,000 megawatt peak this year. Mumbai and Chennai and other cities are half of Delhi, by the way, right? And part of that is because, of course, ownership of air conditioners in Delhi is significant. It's actually north of 30%. The pan-India figure is anywhere between 3 and 5%. So you can imagine Delhi has a, 10 times higher, air conditioner ownership rate. And this is conservative because it's very difficult to estimate at the higher end, who all are ACs. Many people don't report in surveys, etc. So Mumbai also has high penetration of air conditioners, but obviously the population is also not as much as Delhi. Delhi is 30% larger than Mumbai. So in terms of demand, Delhi just, is literally the behemoth there at about 8,000 megawatt. And is it prepared? It absolutely is, because it's the capital territory. Investments have gone into infrastructure preparation. The transmission infrastructure is in place. We've not seen events which have sort of occurred because Delhi's not been able to import power. And more than 85% of the power in Delhi is literally coming from the outside, barring, some contribution from the plants that are embedded within the city, which are the gas-based plants.
We started out with heat waves. And now, do you feel, for example, or rather, let me put it this way, what could be the impact of heat waves, which means temperatures beyond what we've seen, or at least temperatures running consistently for long periods of time at levels which we've not seen before?
So there are two aspects to it. There's an energy component to it and there's a power component. So when the peak in the peak temperature in the day reaches, right, whether it's midday, late afternoon, whatever that might be, and it sustains for a while, there is going to be increased demand on air conditioning, whether it's in homes or in commercial establishments or even in other places. And energy requirements are likely to be sort of little more suppressed because it's not persisting throughout. But that's it. The point, the situation you're trying to talk about here is where it's persistently high. And the reality here is that, we don't really have a sense of what is this latent demand in India which is not being met. Right? There are obviously lots of people, under extreme heat circumstances who are trying to use electricity, whether it's for use of fans and coolers or even air conditioners, and how much of that is not being met. What we found is that last year, right, the shortages that states reported were anywhere between, or regions reported, right? We have 4 big regions in the country, north, east, west, and south, anywhere between 1 and 6 gigawatt. Totaling that is a little sort of, not easy because they occur at different times during the day. This year, they're expecting that the total deficit or the peak deficit in the country could be up to 14 gigawatt. So they're already sort of talking of a scenario, right, where we may not be able to meet the demand up to 14 gigawatt, which is a non-trivial number, right? Because if our overall demand being met is about 235, 40 gigawatt, and if you are saying that 14 gigawatt is not met, that's like, close to about 8%. And that is likely to happen. And in terms of power plants themselves, one of the things we must remember is that water availability is a significant challenge. But touch wood, we have come to a point where I think less than a gigawatt worth of capacity typically is on outage because of water availability. But biggest outage category for thermal power plants is basically boilers and turbines, specifically the boilers, which we know that on consistent operation at high loads, they are likely to see the kind of, outages. And that's, that could anywhere range between 8 and 10 gigawatt. And that is a problem. And ambient heat does play a role in decreasing the efficiency of some of these systems.
Right. Karthik, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks.
The semiconductor subsidy race expands. More countries are joining the semiconductor subsidies race, and we've been talking about, including earlier of the United States offering tens of billions of dollars in subsidies to companies like Intel and Taiwan Semiconductor, which is TSMC, to set up manufacturing in the United States as they have begun doing. Now, the context being that while India itself is offering around $10 billion of subsidies, we cannot afford a subsidy race beyond a point, acknowledging at the same time that semiconductors are a critical and sensitive item, including from a geopolitics point of view. So the latest to join in is South Korea, which is preparing a program to provide more than $7.3 billion to strengthen its semiconductor industry, Bloomberg reported the South Korean finance minister saying. Semiconductor manufacture, just to reiterate, is as much a manufacturing story as it is of geopolitics. The United States government is pressing allies, including South Korea, to further tighten restrictions on China's access to semiconductor technology. America also wants South Korea to restrict the flow of equipment and technologies for making high-end logic and memory chips to China, Bloomberg News is reporting. Korea is already the world's biggest memory chip producer and is now investing $470 billion in a semiconductor mega cluster just outside of Seoul. Tech investments are pouring into Southeast Asia. Speaking of investments in semiconductors and electronics in general, a big chunk of investments are heading to Southeast Asia too, many of which, or some of which at least, India should be or ought to be competing for. Long considered a tech hinterland, Southeast Asia is fast emerging as a center of gravity for the industry, Bloomberg is saying in a special report, also saying that CEOs of Apple Inc., Microsoft, Nvidia are amongst the industry chiefs who've been swinging through the region in recent months, committing billions of dollars in investment and holding forth with heads of states from Indonesia to Malaysia, including now Amazon, which last week unveiled a $9 billion investment plan in Singapore. For just data centers, the world's biggest companies could spend about $60 billion in coming years as data consumption shoots up in Southeast Asia's 675 million population, many of them young. The region's moment has arrived as China turns more hostile to United States firms and India remains tougher to navigate politically, says Bloomberg. Among others, Tim Cook and Satya Nadella last month embarked on their biggest tours across Southeast Asia in years. And by 2028, says Bloomberg, Southeast Asia will become the second largest non-US source of data center revenue in the world. Among other places, investments are pouring in, including southern Malaysia, where Nvidia is already building a $4.3 billion data center park. Nvidia is also looking at Vietnam. Now, the counter to this in some ways is that a lot of resources on the human side are coming into India, including with companies like Nvidia, who are investing extensively to set up global design and research centers. But the manufacturing race, which we are also in, is something that we obviously cannot lose sight of. Why India's dependence on pharmaceutical raw materials from China is not going down. This is a worrying story. India imports a substantial part of its bulk drugs or pharmaceutical raw materials from China. The Economic Times, quoting a Bloomberg report, says a company like Aurobindo Pharma gets about 55% of its raw materials for ingredients from China. Aurobindo, in turn, supplies the most generic drugs by volume to the United States, and its $3 billion in 2023 revenue was the second highest amongst Indian drug makers. So that clearly is one side of the story. On the other side, India is importing more bulk drugs from China in both value and volume terms, rising from 64 and 62% about 10 years ago to about 71 and 75% last year. To put it more simply, nothing has changed since COVID, the time when alarm bells were ringing furiously and India was precariously perched when it came to sourcing pharmaceutical raw materials. Apparently, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval had warned in 2014, that's again 10 years ago, that dependence on Chinese active pharmaceutical ingredients or APIs could be a national security threat. A key reason is price. Indian manufacturers are just not able to respond, and the many government schemes, including the ongoing production-linked incentives or PLI schemes, while they're working, are yet not able to replicate the Chinese dominance in basic chemicals, all of which, ironically, India was very strong in. The Economic Times says also that amoxicillin, a hugely used penicillin derivative, was dumped by the Chinese at $9 to $10 per kilogram against the set international range of $25 to $30 per kilogram. So where is all this headed? I reached out to Reji K. Joseph, an associate professor at the Institute of Studies in Industrial Development, who's done considerable work in the area of pharmaceutical materials, including recent articles on the efficacy of the PLI system in an industry that's otherwise dominated by small and medium enterprises. I began by asking Dr. Joseph, a PhD in economics, where we stood in terms of pharmaceuticals, raw materials, including APIs.
See, when we talk about the pharmaceutical market, there are two categories of products. One is formulation. In formulations, we are doing perfectly fine. We are producing the entire range of the essential formulations that we require. The formulations are basically the finished dosage forms that we consume when we fall ill. So there we are very competitive and we are exporting to more than 170 countries. So there we don't face any problem. The second category is the active pharmaceutical ingredients, drug intermediates, and the key starting materials, which we can call pharmaceutical raw materials. So here we are very much dependent on imports. And in some cases, there is no production at all in India, and the entire requirement we are sourcing from one single country, China. And roughly speaking, we can say about 70% of our requirement of pharmaceutical raw material we are sourcing through import. So this is the overall situation of current production right now.
And in within this 70%, what are the dominating or dominant APIs or other materials?
Penicillin is one category, then some vitamins, and their drug intermediates, and key starting material. So we cannot say a few APIs, but there are a range of APIs and their drug intermediates and key starting materials in which we are heavily import dependent. In some cases, entirely all our requirements we are importing. There is no production happening in India at all.
And was this production happening earlier and then stopped because of price reasons, or is it something that we've not done at all?
That is an interesting case. So we know when we got independence, we did not have any indigenous pharma industry here. But later on, through various government initiatives, we developed an industry. And in the 1970s and 80s, we see the API production happening in India. But that was not an automatic process. So in the 1970s, when the government was pushing the development of indigenous pharma industry, the government found that the firms are more keen to get into the formulation business rather than the API business. So then when inquired what is the reason for that, it was found that the pharmaceutical raw materials or APIs is a segment where the capital investment requirement is more and the economic return is less. So that is why firms are not keen to get into that business. But then government adopted a few measures to incentivize and compel them to get into the API product. One was called ratio parameter. In the drug policy, the government introduced policy suggesting if a firm had to sell formulation in the market, then they had to produce APIs indigenously. So the sale of formulation was linked to the production of APIs indigenously. So the firms had a compulsion to produce. Not only that, the government also restricted the import of API. So they could source the APIs from anywhere. They had to produce internally. So this was the kind of policy environment government created. And to support that, the government also used the CSIR network of laboratories. So they were tasked to collaborate with the enterprises to develop the process technologies required for them. So that is how India developed an ecosystem where the active pharmaceutical ingredients were produced.
So after COVID, one of the things that happened, Dr. Joseph, as we know, that we committed as a country that we would reduce the dependence on external imports of APIs and other pharmaceutical raw materials, including from countries like China, because that was a sensitive and a geopolitical issue as well. But after that, we don't seem to have yet made the kind of headway that we would have liked to make, which is now almost 3 to 4 years. And despite all the commitments, promises, and I'm sure ambitious, let's say, steps, why is that?
See, after the COVID pandemic, so government has felt the need of reducing the import dependence, and the government has introduced a PLA scheme entirely dedicated for this purpose. And firms are also, they have realized the need to overcoming the dependence. But the major challenge is, the major concern is the price at which the production should happen. Because if you look at the overall business scenario of the Indian pharma industry, it is increasingly becoming export oriented. So now more than half of the turnover of the industry is coming from exports. So then what is driving the exports? The studies have found that it is a cheaper import of raw materials that is driving the export of Indian pharma industry. So that means if we are not able to produce at prices lower than the Chinese prices, then our export competitiveness will be affected. So this is a major dilemma that the industry is facing. So this shows that there is a need to invest in R&D for development of better production technologies. So who will invest in R&D? Here we have to realize that the this segment is dominated by small and medium enterprises. And they do not have the kind of financial resources to make huge investments in R&D. So we cannot expect major R&D investments coming from the firms operating in this segment. Then the other concern is that suppose some firms make some investment in R&D, but it may be possible that the Chinese producers, they come up with better technologies. So then again, they will be facing a problem. So this has created an investment dilemma for the enterprises, and this is majorly affecting their decision to get into production. So this is an area the government needs to get into to address the investment dilemma.
Right. So PLI was, or production linked initiatives, is clearly one intervention where you are trying to reduce the cost, at least of capital cost. What else can we do at this point to maybe, encourage Indian manufacturing in pharmaceutical raw materials? And if within that, where do you feel the maximum emphasis should be, either in terms of category or drug or related raw materials?
We are competing with Chinese producers. Okay. So we have to achieve the price competence vis-a-vis the Chinese producers. So the Chinese have many things in their favor, like the huge scale of operation, then the cool climate they have. To overcome those advantages which they have, the only solution for Indian producers is better technologies. Okay. So here, one thing is in our favor, that is the huge network of scientific laboratories we have under the CSIR network. So these laboratories can be asked to identify suitable technologies in those areas where we are heavily import dependent. So if these laboratories are asked to get in touch with the industry and to develop appropriate technologies in a collaborative manner, then things will work. So this is the only way I feel we can come out of this import dependence issue.
And what stops this from happening right now?
So there is no clear answer for that. So when we talk to the industry, they say, yes, we need support of these academic institutions, research laboratories, but it is not very easy to collaborate with them. How this can be done, we do not have any clear answer. But this is the only way, in my view, to address this issue.
Right. And you feel that capital itself is not so much of a constraint? Let's say if you were to pick up penicillin, the example you took, and say, okay, a business person wants to set up penicillin manufacturing capacity of a certain size and scale. Could she or he do that? And if so, what would be the constraints?
See, I don't think capital is a major constraint. I feel it is the technology where the firms feel the constraint. Because the main concern is that we should be able to produce at competitive prices. So for that, we need technology. And again, see, I interacted with some firms which recently took some initiatives to produce penicillin. To get technology, again, they are collaborating with Chinese technicians. Okay, so they are sourcing technology from China. Chinese technicians need to visit India. So this is how they are planning to work out. Then one issue that is coming up is the visa. Chinese technicians, they don't get visa easily. And this is another issue that these Indian producers are facing, who are trying to catch up with Chinese.
Right. Dr. Joseph, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much.
That was the core report with me, Govindraj Ethiraj. Do stay connected with more of our coverage at the core. You can check out our website or sign up to our newsletter for our exclusive stories, one in-depth feature a day on www.thecore.in. Do also track us on LinkedIn, where we usually post synopses or extracts of our top stories and interviews. We would love your feedback on how we can make business more interesting and relevant, including, of course, India's vibrant manufacturing sector. So write to us at feedback@thecore.in, and thank you once again for listening.